It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first talk since we celebrated the events of April 19, 1775. In a few moments, we will welcome Don Hagist to provide an unusual perspective on the historic events and individual experiences of that day. But first, let me thank you stalwarts who have ventured out on this unusually warm evening. We're very surprised that so many of you here. Now let's set the stage for this evening. For almost 2 years, we have been focused on what noted historian Mary Beth Norton called the long year of 1774. From the Boston Tea Party, known at the time as the destruction of the tea, to the first shots on an April morn, which we all know occurred first in Lexington and on to Concord, with a prominent role for the Acton Minutemen. This evening, we will begin to shift to a second, less well-understood period, the Siege of Boston, continuing until March 17, 1776, Evacuation Day, when the British concluded they could not dislodge the colonial army, dug in and capable of disabling ships of the fleet. The Acton 250 Committee has appreciated the opportunity to build partnerships which we hope will endure with the Acton Historical Society, Ironwork Farm, Inc., Acton's Public Libraries, Heinhoff, ActonTV, the Acton Minutemen, the Acton Lions, Freedom's Way, the AB Schools, and the Senior Center. Please take a moment at the end to look over materials and chat with their reps. Do consider joining one or more of these worthy groups as a token of your recognition of the effort each makes to create a sense of community in Acton, both past and present. A special thanks to the Acton Lions Club, which has underwritten tonight's speaker. In conjunction with the charter given to the Acton 250 Committee, its History Subcommittee, which identifies speakers and books, has sought to highlight the voices previously unheard or unrecognized in the traditional history that so many of us learn. We have heard over and over that we are the beneficiaries of an explosion of available primary sources. This evening will be no different. What will be different is thinking about the experience of individual British soldiers who had no choice but to be involved in the first shots of the American Revolution and the gruesome afternoon which followed. Remembering the major events of our countdown to April 19th, the lag time from the destruction of the tea to the arrival of the official word of the Crown's response, almost a half year, which turned out to be so much worse than anticipated, including the closure of the Port of Boston and the abrogation of rights granted in the Charter of 1691, the right to call town meeting, and local control of many judicial processes. John Adams is often noted for his quote, "The revolution is in the hearts and minds of the people." Our previous speakers, Bob Allison, J.L. Bell, and Joe Bowie, have done a wonderful job of explaining that a fundamental change took place before the shots were fired. Parliament had prohibited the import of armaments, and so the colonists gathered what they had and pilfered from the British troops what they could, including cannons. Our last talk focused on the web of spies on both sides operating in the colonies. I think I would be remiss not to make mention of the celebration of the Battle of Bunker Hill this past weekend. It seemed crucial when I first studied American history to note that it took place on Breed's Hill. Due now to the availability of previously unknown primary sources and a more sophisticated perspective, this year much attention has been focused on the death of Dr. Joseph Warren, only 34 years old, who might have numbered among the founders if he had survived the battle. But back to April 19th. We have the opportunity to think anew about the experiences of the foe, especially the rank and file members of the British Army, caught marching in unison for all time in the four very well-known engravings of Amos Doolittle. Who were they? What was it like to be serving in Boston in 1775 at the periphery of the mighty British Empire? Many in this room know the struggle experienced by Isaac Davis's widow for recognition from our federal government for her loss. What emotional toll might the day have taken on his counterparts and their families? We shall soon hear a new perspective on the impact of that day. Remember, links to recordings of previous speakers and order information for Acton 250 merchandise are available at the Acton 250 Events website. It is the intention of the Acton 250 History Subcommittee to continue to present speakers to help us grasp the experiences of our Acton forebears immediately after April 19th, through to the Declaration of Independence. Look for Beyond the Bridge updates throughout the year. Should you wish to make an individual donation to support this effort, please see me or Bob Ferrara, who's disappeared for a moment, for information on how to do so. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Don Hagist, currently Managing Director of the Journal of the American Revolution, and author of 3 recent books focused on his topic this evening, the British soldiers occupying the other side of the bridge on April 19th and throughout the Revolutionary period. Don has also served as a consultant to Ken Burns on the upcoming PBS series, The American Revolution, scheduled to be released in November. A Q&A will follow his talk, and you will have an opportunity to purchase one of his books. May I hear a warm welcome for Don.
All right. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming out here on such a warm day. When they told me this was a really cool place, I assumed that they were just talking about the air conditioning. But I'm looking at the artwork on the walls and these puppets, and I think this is amazing. You guys have a really great library here, and I've only seen one room of it. But it's pretty awesome. And I'm excited to be here to get to talk about one of my favorite topics that I like to study. But first, I'm going to talk about an individual named Samuel Lee. Now, on the off chance that you've heard of this guy before, please don't offer any spoilers. All right? Samuel Lee was born in London in 1745, so he's an Englishman, and he was a tailor by trade. And in fact, he was a pretty good tailor. By 1774, he was a master tailor. And he came to America in 1767, working at his trade as a tailor. He spent time in Philadelphia, he spent time in New Jersey, he spent time in New York. Again, all the while he was working as a tailor. By 1775, he had become a master tailor, so he was supervising probably at least 9 or 10 other tailors in his work. He had a wife and family with him, and he came to Massachusetts in 1774. On April 19th, he was one of the ones who turned out on that day. And he probably sounds a lot like people from Acton or Concord or Lexington who turned out that day, right? But in fact, he was a private soldier in the 18th Regiment of Foot in the British Army. He was a member of their Grenadier Company, and he was one of the soldiers who came out on the expedition from Boston on April 19th to Concord. And yet, until we got to that last line, he sounds pretty similar to everybody who you would think is serving in the American Army, right? Well, we're going to talk more about some of these people, and maybe there'll be some more surprises like that, because we often don't think about who all those redcoats were as individual people. But he's pretty typical of the British soldiers who came out from Boston in 1775. He had joined the army. I actually don't know when he joined the army, probably around 1758 to 1760. Remember, there were lots of British troops in America before any war broke out. I really appreciate the perspective you gave in the introduction to remind people the very important thing that the revolution started before the war began, because it's very important to decouple the rebellion from the war. There was a revolution, and that caused a war to begin. But this guy didn't come over to America to fight a war. He was just sent to America as a soldier in the army. And he was stationed in America as a soldier, working at his profession for the army for 8 years before war broke out in America. And so were a lot of the other guys. So he was part of the garrison in Boston in April 1775. So what is this garrison like? Well, in 1774, as was alluded to already, in a reaction to the Boston Tea Party, the British government clamped down on the civil unrest in Massachusetts, and they said, we've had enough of this civil unrest that's been going on for 10 years now, not just the Boston Tea Party, but lots of things before that. We've had enough. We're shutting down your government, installing a temporary military government until things are straightened out. And to help keep the peace in Boston, we're sending a whole lot of soldiers. By April 1775, that's 10 regiments, which means about 5,000 men. When you see the word regiment, which you'll see a lot when you're reading about the war, if you think of a regiment as being about 500 men, that's in the ballpark. That's the right order of magnitude. You know, regiments were some were a little bigger, some were smaller, changed over time. But if you think 5,000 men, that'll give you a sense of the scale. And just for your reference, they were the 4th, 5th, 10th, 23rd, 38th, 43rd, 47th, 57th, 59th regiments, a portion of the 18th regiment. You may have keyed in that the British numbered their infantry regiments. And there was also a battalion of Marines. A battalion is the same size as a regiment. It's just a composite organization instead of a permanently established organization. So more or less the same thing, 10 regiments. Some of them are Marines. And just as a point of reference, you will read books here and there that like to talk about these and say, oh, the 5th Regiment was the Northumberland Regiment, and the 10th Regiment was the Lincolnshire Regiment. And in 1775, that was not true. These titles for counties were given to regiments in 1782. They have nothing to do with the American Revolution, and yet because they sound cool, some authors like to use them anyway. So get the regional recruiting thing and county titles out of your head in case it was in there. So what is a regiment? Well, as I said, the established size of a regiment changed during the war. You'll find books that try to pin it down like 447 officers and men. Well, okay. That's possible. But the size changed during the course of the war. Sometimes we detach pieces of regiments here and there. But I said think of it as about 500 men. I cheated a little bit. All of the soldiers who were in Boston had come to try to prevent war from beginning. They were sent to keep the peace, not to start a war. And the army was on a peacetime establishment. Great Britain wasn't sending troops to America to fight. They were sending them to keep order. So the regiments were about 400 men when they were in Boston. Later in the war, the army changed to a war footing. They increased the size of the army overall and increased the size of regiments. Now it's closer to 500 men. And that's a real pedantic detail, you're right? We're on the right track if we just think of it. This. And in a regiment, there's a reason why we're going to go into this level of detail. It'll make sense in a minute. A regiment is divided into 10 companies, which are all exactly the same size. And a company consists, in 1775, of 3 officers, 5 non-commissioned officers, 1 drummer, and 36 private soldiers. That numbers changed later in the war as the Army was increased, but for this nice little time in Boston, it's neat to study because things were so orderly. 2 of these companies, if a company is 1/10 of a regiment, how many men are in a company? If a regiment's about 500, then there's about 50 in a company, or 40, depending on when you are. 2 of them were specialized. We have a company of grenadiers. They're tall, robust men. And they're called grenadiers, but they did not throw hand grenades at this time period. That was an honorific, very much like the US Army today has cavalry, but they don't ride horses anymore, but they still called cavalry. These were still called grenadiers, even though they had long since stopped throwing hand grenades. And we have a company of light infantry. This was a newfangled thing at this time period. Light infantry companies were formed in British regiments in 1771, so brand new thing. And they're agile, active men who can skirmish. They can go running off over hill and dale and spread out in the woods and do specialized kinds of fighting. Anybody who's in these 2 companies has to be a very capable soldier, and part of that means they have to have at least a year of experience in the Army. They have to at least really have gone through all of their, what today we would call basic training, had some experience, and especially been trustworthy and capable of thinking on their feet and doing very active, specialized activities. One of these guys was named John Smith. I'm going to punctuate this talk with mentions of individuals. So John Smith was born in St. Andrews, Norfolk in 1731. He was a dyer by trade, part of Britain's burgeoning textile industry. And he joined the 4th Regiment of Foot in 1754 at the age of 23, which is a pretty typical enlistment age. We'll talk a little more about that later. And he was wounded in the leg in 1762 in the siege in Martinique. But that didn't stop him from soldiering on. By April 19th, he was in the Grenadier Company of the 4th Regiment of Foot, one of these specialized companies. 44 years old. He was wounded through his thigh at Concord. Now, we don't know exactly where he was when he was wounded. It says at Concord. It was probably somewhere during the retreat on that day. But he continued to serve as a soldier for another 13 years after getting his 2nd wound. He was discharged from the Army in 1788 when he was 55 years old after 31 years of service. And once again, this is a very typical career for a British soldier in the American Revolution. The challenge I have when I want to put together a slide like this is not finding somebody with a long career, it's figuring out which one among thousands to choose and single out to put on the slide. Everything about his career, with the possible exception of the specific wounds, is very typical of these soldiers who were serving on April 19th. One day out of a 31-year career in the Army for this guy, and not his only battle, not his only wound. His company, by the way, that he served in also went on to serve in battles in Brooklyn and Brandywine and Germantown and other places. So this wasn't the most special, remarkable day for him. April 19th, 1775, when the British commander in Boston decides he needs to send troops out to seize arms in Concord, really hoping he'll find those 2 stolen brass cannons, if you were here at one of the earlier talks. He chooses light infantry and grenadier companies because these are his most experienced active soldiers, most capable of doing what he knows is going to be a 40-mile round trip. Not an easy march. Got to choose the guys who are particularly good. And he sends them out for the secret expedition. This ends up being about 700 men. Some of these companies aren't quite up to full strength. You know, men are sick. Some might be on some other specialized duty. So each company now has probably about 30, 32, 33 private soldiers in it. They're the best trained, most fit, fastest marching guys in the Army. 10 light infantry companies and 11 grenadier companies. That guy at the beginning from the 18th Regiment of Foot, only part of that regiment was in Boston. The Grenadier Company was there with a couple others. The Light Infantry Company, they were in Kaskaskia, Illinois at this time, where we don't often think about British soldiers being posted, but there they were. So 11 Grenadier companies, 10 Light Infantry companies. Among them was Alexander MacLean, born in 1752 in St. Mary's, Kilkenny in County Leinster in Ireland. Leinster in Ireland, rather. He was a fifer in the Grenadier Company of the 38th Regiment of Foot, and he was wounded in the left arm at the Battle of Bunker Hill 2 months after Lexington and Concord. But he continued to serve in the Army, eventually rose to the rank of a sergeant, stayed in the Army until 1796 at the age of 54. Got an Army pension for 31 years of service. And then he joined an Irish militia regiment and continued to serve for a few more years until 1804 when he was 62 years old. You may have discerned that these men are career soldiers. They didn't come just for this little thing going on in America. These guys were part of a regular professional army. And most of them have careers something like this if they don't get sick or get disabled or get wounded so severely they can no longer serve. Again, nothing unusual about this guy's career. I keep calling it the British Army. Some texts will call it the English Army, but England is only part of Britain, right? We also have Scotland and Ireland. We even have Wales in there. And we also have, because it's the British Empire, we have soldiers in the British Army from places like America and Hanover, which is a British protectorate in the European continent at this time. I know the nationality right now of 200 soldiers who've marched to Concord. I make it my work to find these individuals, but I know the names of almost all of the British soldiers who were in these Grenadier and Light Infantry companies that marched out that day. Not quite all of them yet, but almost all of them. And I know details of about 200 of them, which isn't a bad statistical sample. And of that 200 that I know the nationality of, I know there were 111 who were English, 36 who were Scottish, 3 who were Welsh, 49 who were Irish. And is there one more bullet there? There is, 1 American in the ranks. Why so few Welsh? Well, the population of Wales was quite small. This is more or less a reflection of the population density of these different nations within Great Britain. Excuse me there. With the exception of the American, there are, of course, a lot more men in America than that. But, if you took a single British regiment out of Boston and polled all the men and asked them their nationalities, you'd get a proportion about like this. If you took a single British regiment out of any British place during the American Revolution and polled their nationalities, for most of the regiments, you'd get a distribution pretty much like this. There were a few exceptions later in the war, but most British regiments had a mix of nationalities and in roughly these kinds of proportions. And among the English, all over England. Among the Scottish, all over Scotland. Among the Irish, all over Ireland. No localized recruiting at this time period. Let's look at another one. Here's John Mosley. Here's his signature down there. He was born in 1744 in Leicester, Leicestershire in England. 5'6" 3/4 inches tall, enlisted in the 11th Regiment of Foot in 1764. Well, that regiment wasn't on our list, but it didn't have to be because he transferred into a different regiment. By April 1775, he was in the Light Infantry Company of the 5th Regiment of Foot, and he was wounded in the left arm on April 19th. Do you suppose that stopped him from soldiering? Probably not. He was wounded again at Bunker Hill just 2 months later. And he was wounded again in the right knee at the Battle of Brandywine 2 years later. But he continued to serve as a soldier in the British Army until June 1784, when finally he was discharged. And like all of these guys I've talked about so far, he received an Army pension. Actually, one of the guys didn't receive a pension. I'll talk about that later. But like most of them, he got a pension from the Army. What other professions in England at this time period or in Great Britain besides being a soldier in the Army, offered you a pension? There weren't any. So there is an incentive to join the Army here, if for that no other reason, for that alone. It was a fairly progressive institution in many ways, and this was one of the ways. Let's look at their ages a little bit. We had some different ages. There was a guy born in 1731 there, right? And another born in 1754. When you enlisted in the Army at this time, in the British Army, if you enlisted in peacetime, you enlisted as a career. You did not enlist for a fixed period of time, like a 4-year stint or a 2-year hitch or whatever. You just enlisted. And you served until you were no longer fit for service. Fit for service means you're able to do something like walk from downtown Boston to Concord and back on the same day. That's a long walk, but if you're in good shape, you can still do that well into your 40s, right? Into your early 50s, some people. It's not absurd. The men who marched out on April 19th were all career soldiers. And as you've seen, some of them had been in the Army 10, 20 years before April 19th. This was not new to them. After the war was going full bore, and the British government realized they needed to make a stronger commitment and increase the size of the Army, they did change the recruiting laws such that you could enlist for a shorter period, the duration of the war as long as you were in for at least 3 years. But no soldiers who served in Boston enlisted under these terms. They all went into effect on December 16th. When did the British soldiers leave Boston once and for all? March 1776. Nobody enlisted and got over here that fast. They had training to go through and other things before they'd be sent overseas. So all of the soldiers here, most of them enlisted during peacetime. Some had enlisted even longer ago during a previous war, but they all enlisted as a career. So they're all going to serve for as long as they needed to. 700 soldiers in Boston, April 19th. I know the age so far of 202 of them. The research is ongoing. It's not easy to find this information. It takes a while. But so far, ages of 202 soldiers. Has anybody here played the British soldier age game before? No? 202 men on April 19th. How many do you suppose were between the ages of 15 and 20 years old? You can give your answer as a number or a percentage. 6 altogether? 6%? Well, I know, okay. So in this first category, how many? 6% or 6 altogether?
I'll go 6 altogether.
And 1%. Okay, yeah, you guys are pretty good. It was 5 altogether, which is less than 3% for those who are good at math. Yeah, you're in the right ballpark. How many are between 21 and 25 years old?
About the same.
About the same. 50 altogether, 50%.
50 altogether.
50 altogether. Okay, you guys are very perceptive because you can kind of suss out where this is going based on what I've said before. It was 33 altogether, which is, now I'm keeping a running total in this column. So from the ages of 15 to 25, we've accounted for just under 20% of the soldiers so far. So how many of them are between 26 and 30? Well, that works out to be about 40%. So we're getting into the sweet spot here. Then we have about 53 of them, the biggest single portion between 31 and 35 years old. And then it starts to drop off a bit, and a bit, and a bit more. If you want to see a standard distribution, you know, a bell curve, you got yourself a bell curve here, right? If you took any regiment out of Boston and polled them all and asked their ages, or any British regiment during the American Revolution and polled them all and asked their ages, most of the time you'd get a distribution pretty much like this. About 60% of the men are between the ages of 25 and 40, and about 20% are younger, and about 20% are older. Well, if you think about enlisting, usually in your early 20s, a few people enlisted in their teens, but proportionally quite few. And you think about serving for 20 years or so, it only makes sense you're going to end up with a distribution like this, right? So it just falls very naturally out of the way the Army worked during this time period. Now, conscripts. You've heard about compulsory service, being pressed into the Army, right? Today we might call it being drafted. That term had a very different meaning in the 18th century. Of all of these soldiers in Boston in 1775, and the ones who marched down on April 19th, how many do you suppose were conscripts? Pressed, forced to serve. What proportion? Anybody else? 5%. 5%? I heard 0%. It is a trick question because the answer is indeed 0. It was not legal for the British government to press people into the Army during this time period. And you will see a lot of books that really have this messed up. They have it messed up because they look at things like the Army in the 18th century and assume everything was the same the whole time, when it wasn't. It wasn't legal. All enlistment in the British Army during this time period was voluntary. All of these guys who marched out on April 19th were volunteers, and they were career soldiers, an all-volunteer career army. Now, why do some people mess this up? Well, because 1778 comes around. What was the big important thing that happened during the American Revolution as far as the British government was concerned in 1778? Changed the entire complexion of the war.
Change of prime minister.
Not yet. That won't come in a few more years. Way in the back.
France joins as an ally of America.
France joins the war. All of a sudden, Great Britain has, instead of fighting a war that's 3,000 miles away, they've got an enemy that you can see on a clear day. And they got a big old army. So Great Britain needs to drastically increase the size of their army now, and they need to do it fast, so they create a press act. Now, there's a whole lot of parameters about who you can press, specific locations, specific aspects of who you can press and what times a year and all this. It's not just this blanket thing where you can drag anybody in the army. And they revised the Press Act in 1779, and then they repeal the Press Act in 1780. When did the war end? 83. Why would they repeal this right in the middle of a great big war with not only now France, but also Spain?
They knew they were going to turn it down.
It went really, really, really badly. There were two populations that hated the Press Act. One of those populations was the people who were liable to be pressed. They hated it. Who else would hate this Press Act?
Their families.
It was the Army hated the Press Act. Remember all these volunteer career soldiers? How do you think they feel about saying, hey, you get to serve next to this guy who doesn't want to be here? The Army didn't like it at all. The officers hated it. The soldiers hated it. It went so badly that they repealed it. And as far as America goes, remember, it's fighting a global war now, hardly any pressed men were sent to serve in America. Only a few hundred out of an army of 50,000 or so. But you will find books that just kind of look at this and say, it's true to say there was a Press Act during the American Revolution. Right? Absolutely true. But that makes you assume that the Army just pressed men willy-nilly all throughout the American Revolution, right? And that's not true at all. So this pressing had nothing to do with anything going on in Boston and almost nothing to do with anything going on in America at all during this whole war. Here's another guy, James Renison, not pressed into the Army. Born 1743, Kendall County, Westmoreland, Northwest England. 5 foot 6 inches tall, hazel eyes, brown hair, squarely complexion, and a round visage. He was a weaver before he joined the Army in 1759. Before he joined the Army. By 1759, he was Okay, let me try that again. He was a weaver when he joined the Army in 1759 in the 59th Regiment of Foot. By 1775, he was a sergeant in this regiment in Boston, and he was wounded in the thigh on April 19th. So first day of the war, whack, ouch. Didn't stop him from serving in the Battle of Bunker Hill, where he was not wounded, lucky him. And then speaking of lucky him, in December 1775, the 59th Regiment gets sent back to England. They had been in America since 1767, and so they were sent back home. War's over for him, right? Well, maybe not. In 1778, his regiment gets sent to Gibraltar. What happened in Gibraltar during the American Revolution? Anybody? The Spanish and the French tried to take Gibraltar. They besieged the British garrison in Gibraltar for 4 years. And our man James Renison, who had spent that couple little battles in America, was right there. He was discharged in 1788, age 45, with 29 years of service, and he received a pension, a sergeant's pension, which was not so bad thing. What do you suppose he does now? Maybe? What's he going to do now? He's a weaver, that's right. He's got a pension from the Army. He does what thousands of British soldiers like him did when they were discharged from their regiment because they didn't need him anymore. He enlisted in the Army again. Same year, he joined the 6th Regiment of Foot. He served for 3 more years. He was discharged in 1791. He goes back on the pension rolls. Now what's he going to do? That's right. He enlists again. 95th Regiment of Foot, discharged 1797. Somewhere in this long career, he lost his middle finger. We don't know where. Maybe the recruiting officer bit it off. I don't know. But discharged in 1797. Remember, he enlisted way back in 1759. Now what's he going to do? Nope, he joins the Army again. He gets put in what's called an invalid corps. Now, that doesn't mean that they are not able to do anything. These are guys who are not fit to be deployed overseas, but Britain has lots of forts and garrisons on the home island, and they need soldiers to serve them. So it's like being a kind of light duty. And he serves in the garrison of Chester until 1802 at the age of 59, after a little over 40 years in the Army. And then, in 1803, they called him up again to serve, but they decided, okay, he's no longer fit for service. Once again, this career is typical of British soldiers. Men who were discharged from the Army, often because the Army was downsized and they just didn't need enough men. You've been in here 20 years, we don't need you anymore. Turned right around and enlist again and keep serving. Served their entire lives, almost literally, in the Army. Not hard at all to find guys like this. Lots of them. Experience, 700 men on April 19th. So far, I've determined the length of the careers of 240, at least from the time of enlistment until April 19th, so I know something about how much experience they had. It works out that 3 of them had been in the Army for only a year, 37, 2 to 5 years, 91 of them, 6 to 10 years, 95, 11 to 20 years, and 21 of them, 14 years or more. These guys knew soldiering when they marched out on April 19th. It was not some bunch of raw recruits or inexperienced men. And again, from all you've seen, it makes sense that we've got a lot of guys with this kind of experience. I have every reason to believe this is a good statistical sample, by the way. It is possible to get the careers of more of them and add to this data, but I'm very sure that the distribution isn't going to change here. So we've got experienced, again, career professional soldiers. One of them was named Richard Brunton. He was born in 1749 in Birmingham, England. 6'1" tall, dark hair, light skin, and he was an engraver. Apparently he was educated. He was apprenticed to an engraver in 1766. We know that much about him. Enlisted in the 38th Regiment of Foot in 1773. Deserted from the 38th Regiment. He was in the Grenadier Company of the 38th. I don't know why I didn't put that there. So There's every reason to believe he came out on April 19th. He deserted from Verplancks Point in New York. Ever hear of the Battle of Stony Point in 1779? Well, when the British garrisoned Stony Point, they also garrisoned Verplanck Point on the other side of the river. That's where he was. He deserted, settled in New England, became a popular American engraver. In fact, he engraved this. That's why I have the picture. There's a book about him. He also became a forger, which got him sent to Newgate Prison. If you go there in Connecticut, they know a bit about him. And he engraved the only known picture from the 18th century of that prison in Connecticut. So I talked about a weaver, I talked about a dyer, a tailor, an engraver. That's a lot of interesting trades, right? A lot of these guys had learned a skilled trade before joining the army. What did I say the typical enlistment age was for British soldiers? Early 20s. Well, if you're a young man in England in the 18th century, you may very well go to school until you're about 12 years old. Some don't go to school at all, but if you do, and a lot did, until you're about 12. But you're not old enough to join the army yet, so what are you going to do in the meantime? You've got to go to work, son. Yeah, you got to get a job. Absolutely. And get jobs they did. Some of them apprenticeships and some not, but getting a job. Just about all these soldiers, if they're enlisting anywhere from 17 to they're 25 years old, have done some other kind of work before joining the army. Their experience may be limited, some complete apprenticeships, some bounce from job to job. But one way or another, as you'll see in a minute, the army benefited from having skilled tradesmen in its ranks. 700 men who marched out on April 19th. So far, I know the trades of 189 of them, which includes 95 laborers, which just means that they don't have a defined trade, probably agricultural workers, maybe dock workers, construction workers of different types, but no skill. 21 of them are weavers, 11 tailors, 6 carpenters, 4 shoemakers, 4 hosiers, 4 framework knitters, 4 clothiers, 3 each of butchers and coopers, 2 blacksmiths, 2 smiths, 2 dyers, 2 cordwainers. Anybody know what a cordwainer is? One in the back? Nope. Made shoes out of Cordovan leather. He's a specialized shoemaker. And wool combers. Yeah, that one gets everybody. It's sneaky when you put a root word in that has nothing to do with. And then we have 1 each of baker, bleacher, brickmaker, button maker, cabinet maker, cutler, engraver, glover, gunsmith, husbandman, maltster, mason, musician, nailer, sawyer, serge weaver, stockener, stuff weaver, tallow chandler, toy maker, upholsterer, whip maker, white smith, and a wool card maker. Whew, that's a lot of different trades. But look a little carefully, we've got near the top, we've got 11 tailors. Remember that guy at the beginning who was a master tailor? The Army does the own fitting and adjusting of clothing for its soldiers. We have shoemakers. We have a button maker in there. We have a gunsmith. We've got an army that needs to go and fit out buildings as barracks in Boston. And gee, we have carpenters, and I think I see a glazier in there. I guess not on this list. A mason, nailers. We've got a lot of useful skills in here. Sawyers who can make boards for us. The British Army, being an army of empire, has these regiments that are designed to be sent to far off places for 7 to 10 years at a time. But they've got this little community of people with the skills they need that even if they're in some place like Kaskaskia, Illinois, they can sustain themselves just by soldiers in the army working at the trades they learned before they joined the army. Just like that guy at the beginning, Samuel Lee, he was a master tailor for his regiment. And every year the regiment gets new clothing that needs to be fitted and tailored to the men, and he's doing that kind of work. Catherine Rogers was not a soldier. She was a soldier's wife. She was married to Daniel Rogers in the Grenadier Company of the 38th Regiment of Foot. Unfortunately for her, he died of wounds the day after the fighting on April 19th. Now what's she going to do? Well, sadly, we don't know exactly what she did, except that for one reason or another, she stayed with the Army. The British Army left Boston and went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, then came back around and landed on Staten Island, and then captured New York City in 1776. And in 1777, she married another soldier in the 38th Regiment. Now, everything we know about her comes from one document, the marriage license, which says that she was a widow of this other guy, and through Army records, I know who that guy was, and that she married this guy. I don't know what she did, but I do know a lot about wives of British soldiers. And what I know is on a slide. Uh-oh. Okay, I thought I had a different slide to use here. What I know about her, what I know about wives of British soldiers, is that because we have an army that's an army of empire that wants to send soldiers overseas, and it's an all-volunteer force of career soldiers, that it's a pretty good idea to make provision for dependents of those soldiers to go overseas as well. Think of a more modern army that sends soldiers to places like Japan or Korea or Germany and makes provision for dependents to go as well. Anybody hear of an army like that? Yeah, we have one in this country, right? So if we think about people asking, well, why did they send the wives over to Boston too? Well, it shouldn't be such a weird thing to us because our army today still does sort of the same thing. It's just that the living conditions are somewhat different. You know, the wives are a little closer to the soldiers probably than our dependents are now. But in this Boston garrison that in 1775 in April had about 5,000 soldiers in it, grew to be about 10,000 soldiers by the end of that year. About 1 in 6 of those men has a wife with them, and some of them children as well. Catherine Rogers is but one of them. I have information on hundreds of others. And they can do work for the Army as part of the Army's infrastructure. They work as nurses in Army hospitals, which, oh my gosh, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, were in high demand. They work as washerwomen. That's the preeminent job for women in the Army, to wash clothing. Sutlers are purveyors of provisions. Sometimes they get asked to supplement labor forces for things like bringing in hay that the Army desperately needs for forage. Wives of soldiers in Rhode Island helped make peat from peat bogs to use as fuel. Other kinds of work that could be done when necessary. After April 19th, I've talked about 700 British soldiers who marched out. And I know the fate so far of 458 of them. And that's just because, again, it's a lot of work to find this information. It all comes out of primary sources. There's no book that has all this in it already. So we're pulling it together bit by bit. More can be found out, but so far we've got 700. And of those, during the course of the war, 21 of those soldiers eventually deserted. 199 of them had good long careers in the Army and received pensions. 8 of them, at the end of the war, rather than opting for go back to Great Britain and take a pension, were awarded land grants in Nova Scotia. This was another neat term at the beginning of the war. Hey, enlist in the Army, and when the war is over, you can get a land grant. And at the beginning of the war, we're thinking, yeah, that's going to be like in New York or Pennsylvania. And then the war ends, like, oh, yeah, I guess you're not going there, but you can go to Nova Scotia. Well, imagine being a Scottish tenant farmer struggling to till rocky soil in terrible weather for somebody else. And now the Army says, well, guess what? We'll give you 100 acres of land in Nova Scotia where you can till rocky soil in terrible weather, but it's your land. That's a pretty good incentive, right? And many British soldiers end up settling in Nova Scotia. 7 of the men on April 19th became officers, which isn't easy to do during this time period. Less than 0.5% of British soldiers who enlisted into the ranks eventually became officers. There was kind of a glass ceiling there, but it could be broken. 7 did it. 227 of those soldiers died in the service, including 120 of them who were killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the worst day of the war for the British Grenadier and Light Infantry soldiers. I'm going to talk about 1 or 2 more guys. Almost done here. Matthew Hayes, talking about him because he's interesting. Born in 1745 in Ireland. Did anybody come to Joel Bowie's talk that he gave here? Joel's a big fan of this guy. We've worked together on him. He was a sergeant in the 52nd Regiment Foot's Grenadier Company on April 19th, and he was captured and sent to Concord Jail. And there's actually a nice detailed account from the American side about his capture, and there's a surviving gun that might possibly be his, but it's not clear whether it's his. Sent to Concord Jail, but like many British soldiers who became prisoners of war, he escaped, and he got into New York, which in early 1776 was still a British city, but with a lot of conflict. But they still had their royal governor in place. So he goes and he serves with Governor William Tryon. And then Americans try to capture the lighthouse at Sandy Hook off of New Jersey, an important strategic location. And he got this experienced British soldier down there, but no big British garrison. He leads the defense of Sandy Hook Lighthouse, this Lexington and Concord veteran. Then his regiment comes to Boston. The army comes to New York. So he just joins the ranks again. This is great. Serves at battles in Long Island, White Plains, Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth. And then he's able to return to England. And then he gets commissioned as an officer in the 90th Regiment of Foot, a new raised regiment. And he retires as an officer. Not common. This document is from the Massachusetts Archives that just shows the prisoners from April 19th held in Concord Jail. And we've got Matthew Hayes, sergeant, 30 years old, born in Ireland, and a few other little details. This is how we get this kind of information. It's fragmentary, and it takes a long time to pull it all together. But eventually, that's how we know. And another way we know, one last guy. This is Dennis Green of the 5th Regiment of Foot. This is his discharge document. I talked about all these guys who got pensions. 199 of the soldiers on April 19th that I know got pensions. When you're discharged from the Army, which you've joined until you're no longer fit for service and the Army says we don't need you anymore, you got a document called a discharge. And it just says you are legally allowed to not be in the Army anymore. You're not a deserter. You're on your own. Here's your papers. And a lot of these survived. The guys who got pensions, most of them, their discharges still exist. And here's Dennis Green's. It's in the British National Archives. And it's got a lot of data. You see it's a printed form with the details filled in. And at the top, it gives all this stuff, all this demographic material I've been given. They're a rich source of it. Dennis Green, late a soldier in this company of the 5th Regiment, born in the town of Mallow in County Cork. He's this old, and he's 5 feet 11 1/4 inches high, laborer, blah, blah, blah. Says about his service. But this one also has a really neat thing on the bottom of the discharge, an affidavit from the surgeon in the regiment that says, I certify that the above-named Dennis Green has been, for these 5 years, laboring under a complaint occasioned by a musket shot which still remains in his body, that he received at Lexington in North America, and is so reduced in body that it does not seem probable that he will recover and will not by labor be able to provide a maintenance for himself. That's why he is entitled to a pension. This guy was wounded on the first day of the war and carried that bullet with him in his body for the entire remainder of his life. He had that momentum of the war with him forever. But these are the kind of soldiers that served on April 19th. He stayed in the Army for the rest of the 8-year war before being discharged with the bullet that may have been fired by somebody from Acton in him. Seriously, somebody from around here, hit him with a musket ball, stayed in him, but it didn't stop him serving as a soldier. These are the kinds of career soldiers who served in the British Army, and this is the kind of reason that I find them fascinating to study. I've written books about these people. I have one of them here. If you really like this kind of information and want to learn more about it, about Army recruiting, training, and what the life was like for these soldiers, but especially who they are as people, I have some of the books here. I have lots of vignettes about British soldiers, like the ones we talked about on my blog. I have an email address if you have any questions. I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which is at allthingsliberty.com. And you can subscribe absolutely free, because it's free. And I will be happy to take any questions you might have, as long as they're not too hard. I'm going to take one in the back first, just because they were quick over here, and then we'll get yours.
Actually, I've got two questions.
Okay.
Both dealing with the family members of the soldiers. So the wives, they obviously weren't getting paid, so basically their pay was room and board, particularly once they became widows. And then secondly, what do you know about the children?
Okay, there's a couple of good questions there. So we'll start with the wives. They weren't getting paid. Well, that's correct. Does a wife of a soldier today get paid? No. Nothing strange there. Does a wife of a soldier today probably have to get a job in order to help support herself because the pay of a soldier is lousy? Yes. All those women working as nurses are getting paid to work as nurses. And in fact, some of them are earning more than their husbands do. Those women working as washerwomen are getting paid to do that work. The sutlers are getting paid for what they do. So the Army has jobs for the wives to work, or they can go out and find their own work, and they find jobs in town. I find many accounts where the British soldiers' wives have rented their own accommodations, so they don't have to live in the barracks or in the camps. And I don't always know how they earned their money, but clearly they're earning money because they're renting apartments and houses. So soldiers' wives have to work to help support themselves because their husband's income is not terrible, but it's not enough to support a family. And again, if you know people in the military today who are private soldiers or seamen in the Navy, the pay just isn't that good, and you can't support a family on it. So that's not unusual. And what about the children? Well, children are there too, and they follow the Army with the wives. When the Army goes on campaign, sometimes the wives and children stay in the garrisons. The laundry women and the nurses might go with the Army, but it's less common for the women with children to go on the campaigns. Usually they'll stay in the garrisons. And many of those children, because they've grown up around the Army all their lives, when they're old enough, they become fifers, and then they become drummers, and then when they're in their teens, they become private soldiers, and they go on and have their own careers in the Army. In the Army records, you saw this last guy, it said where he was born. It's not unusual to find that says born in the Army. So the Army, a lot, now not all the children, and I actually have an account by a child of a British soldier in America who, when he became 17, his mother said, "You're not doing what Dad did." No way, anything but don't join the Army. And he didn't. But other ones who did. So accounts by children are exceedingly rare, children of soldiers in the Army, but I found a few of them. Does that fully answer the question well enough for now? So yeah, so this garrison in Boston, again, about 1 in 6 soldiers is married, so that ends up being about, by the end of 1775, about 1,500 wives and a similar number of children of soldiers who are all part of the garrison. Your question here.
You said that not very many of the enlisted men ever became officers, so
Correct.
I'm wondering where the officers came from. Did they buy their commissions or deserve it because of education? Or?
Okay, good. So where did the officers come from? I don't study the officers in the level of detail that I study the soldiers, but I'll give you a few high-level things here. We have a society that has a caste system. So there's a gentry class and a non-gentry class. That makes it really easy to set up an army because people don't question who's in authority. it's not nearly as rigorous a caste system as you have in, say, France or Germany or Spain. So there is upward mobility possible. Among the officers, something like 60% of them, most of them, but not 99%, a little over half of them are from landed gentry families. They're second and third and fourth sons who aren't going to inherit anything, but they've been raised on farms or estates and in reasonably high society. They're not nobility. There are a few officers from nobility, but most are not. They're just nice. You watch Downton Abbey, think about children of the family that owns the manor house, those kind of people. They join the army, and they know from an early age that that's probably what they're going to do. Sometimes they come out as volunteers and start being in the army, but with no rank when they're 12 or 13 years old. And then by the time they're 17 or 18, they get a commission and start serving actively as an officer. Some of them are children of other officers, quite a few. Some of them are just children of clergy people or merchants or other people who are not from the lowest class, but they're not nobility either. About 2/3 of them do lodge money in order to obtain a commission. So we say they purchase their commission, but it's not a case where anybody who has a pile of money can buy their way into the army. The regiment has to approve that purchase, and the king has to approve that purchase. So they're not just going to take somebody just because they have money. And remember, a lot of these people purchasing commissions know darn well this is the career they're going to go through. It's the family path for you to be an officer in the army. So they've gotten good educations, including a lot of military studies. And that money for their commission gets lodged with an agent. And when they're ready to retire, they turn around and somebody else buys the commission and they get their money back. And now they can retire because they don't have pensions or anything. But if they do a bad job in the army can cashier them, which means they get thrown out and they don't get the money back. So a lot of disparagement gets given to this purchase system, but there's good mechanics behind it. It's a surety against your good performance as an officer. And you better work hard and do well because you're at risk of losing that commission money, which is your nest egg. It's kind of like your 401k sitting there, and the army can say, oh, cowardice, see ya, cashiered. Now there's a legal process that I have to go through. It's not arbitrary, but that's as much as I can offer on officers right now. It's another whole subject.
As they were here for years prior to the American Revolution, where would they have stayed? And is there any truth to the rumor that I've heard that if you look at some of these old colonial houses and you see the black around the white of the chimney, that means the British soldiers are welcome there?
There is no truth to that second part at all. I never heard that one before, but no. Where did soldiers stay? This is a great question. And you all need to go home and look up the Quartering Act of 1765 because almost all Americans don't understand it. And it is misconstrued to the point that there's actually a question on the United States citizenship test that has the answer wrong about the Quartering Act. That's how badly it's misunderstood. Let's go back to 1763 when the British are looking for sources of revenue from the colonies and they need to post troops in the colonies in order to maintain peace among populations that don't like each other. Settlers who are very land hungry on the coast, Native Americans who have been here since time immemorial who have that very land that these guys want, French-speaking Catholics in Canada who don't get along well with the English-speaking Protestants in New England. How do we maintain order? We're going to have soldiers over there to maintain order. We have a giant war debt. How are we going to pay for this? How do governments pay for anything? Taxes. Well, a provision that's made, once the government decides they need to send troops and keep them in America, They say, well, we can do that, but colonial governments, you're responsible for quartering and provisioning those troops. You colonial governments have to bear the expense of those troops living in America and being fed in America. And some colonies, like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, say, okay, we can do that. We'll build barracks for the troops. And you can even still see one of those barracks in Trenton, New Jersey. Still there. Other colonies like Boston say, or colonies like Boston, colonies like Massachusetts say, we don't want troops quartered around here. We can't do that. And then all kinds of crazy legal machinations go through. Where are we going to put these troops? But the Quartering Act of 1765 says very specifically, you can put these troops in public buildings, you can put them in inns, you can put them in barns, you can put them in warehouses, but you are not allowed to put them in private homes. That's against the law. And you can look up the Quartering Act, the text is on the internet, and read that. It's very specific. The revision in 1774 is very specific. Don't put troops in private homes. Hold off on the questions here. So why do the colonists care so much about this? Why is the Quartering Act a big deal? Who has to pay for the quartering of the troops? The colonial governments. Where do governments get money? Taxes. The governments are going to have to bear an expense that the citizens are going to have to pay for through a tax, and they don't want to do it. And there's also a little more to it where all the colonial charters say each colony pays for its own defense, provides for its own defense. So the colonists don't like the idea that troops are here anyway. But the problem with the Quartering Act is it's forcing the colonial governments to bear additional expense, which is going to have to be paid for by the citizens, and they don't want to pay that money. In the Declaration of Independence, it says one of the complaints is that the king has quartered troops among us. And that means quartered troops in Boston. Those troops weren't staying in people's homes. They were staying in warehouses and other buildings converted into barracks, not in people's homes, but that was quartering troops among us. Then we get around to the constitutional amendment that says it's illegal to put troops in private homes. Well, the British never did that in the first place. But the Americans didn't want it to be able to happen either. So they put this amendment in, but now people think that the amendment's there because the British quartered troops in private homes, even though they never did. And this is all peacetime. Because once war starts, all that goes out the window, and the Americans and British are both putting troops in private homes all the time. And there was a comment over here.
Yes, sir. Looking for clarification.
Okay.
I was under the impression at some point of the occupation of Boston before the war broke out, that literally the English army was at the doorstep of John Hancock's home on Beacon Hill. And I had the impression that the troops were quartered on Boston Common during the good weather and sent into barracks wherever when the weather turned against them. Can you clarify that for me, son?
Sure. Well, almost everything you've said is absolutely right. The troops were camped on Boston Common during the summer, which is not private homes. It's the common land that's there for grazing cattle mostly, but it's common land. And then they were put into barracks for the winter. Now, there weren't any formally built barracks in Boston in 1774. So the British had to convert buildings into barracks, but they didn't convert private homes into barracks. Any buildings they could find, warehouses, storehouses, and places, they converted into barracks. And we can find all the orders. I've got a lot of material about that in my book over here about quartering of troops. The one thing that you talked about that I can't comment on is the British Army being at the steps of John Hancock's house. Well, the British Army has 5,000 men. I don't think they're all on its doorstep. So I'm not sure quite what you mean by that. But now, British officers often rented rooms in people's private homes, but they were not allowed to force that, but they can knock on the door and rent rooms. That's absolutely allowed. And when you start getting vacant houses because people are leaving Boston, you start getting people living in them, but they're not living in people's homes while they're living there at the expense of the people in the houses. Everybody really clear on that? There's a great book called Quarters that goes into wonderful detail about all this and all of the machinations all through the 1760s and 70s of trying to figure out. General Gage, who's the military commander through this whole period in the 1760s and 70s, trying to figure out where are we going to put these soldiers? Every colony has different things, ways they're reacting, and I have to figure out where to put these guys. I can't force them anywhere, trying to make good deals to implement the laws that he's been charged with implementing. Other questions here?
You know, this was the best army in the world, and you're starting to tell us a little bit why. We had a very good long service and very loyal people serve it. Was some of their other technological things, though, that made them the best, or the best trained?
First off, people say, this was the best army in the world, and my engineer brain kicks in and said, how did you measure that? You know, it was a very good army. The British Army had the strongest navy in the world. Their army was quite small by European standards, but they had highly trained career soldiers, and they had a lot of good methodology when a war began of doing things like raising loyal troops in places where they're going to fight the war. So they raised lots of loyalist regiments in America. They raised regiments in India when they're fighting wars there. And they have very good understanding of the transportation and logistics requirements for posting troops overseas for long period of times and all these things. They had modern military technology of the era. One of the things that fascinates me, for example, is we have an artillery school in Woolwich, England, which, by the way, is still there and still the Royal Royal Artillery Academy. But they're teaching cannoneers how to do things like take this cannon that fires a spherical round ball, and we want to fire it against a fortification. And this solid round ball doesn't explode or anything. But if we can fire that ball just the right trajectory so that it skips over the top of the wall, rolls down the inside, and rolls along the platform where all the cannons mounted on the soldiers stand, it'll wreak havoc. And they know how to do this, fire on ricochet. And they know how to measure the fuses for mortar bombs so that those bombs will fly up and they'll explode just before they hit the ground. And they're really sophisticated stuff they're going on with their military science at the time. So these are some of the things that people get at when they say we're the best. It was a technologically advanced army. When they're going through New Jersey in 1777, the Army brought pontoon bridges so that they could readily ford rivers and streams. And Americans wrote about them. Oh my gosh, they've got pontoon bridges. I don't know how many of the Americans knew what a pontoon even was, but they were pretty impressed by this. So it was a very sophisticated, well-trained army, and they had career soldiers. They adapted very quickly to the style of fighting necessary for America. If you can find this book, I don't have here, but this goes into great detail about how the army adapted to the fighting. And never look at an army and judge their performance by the first 1 or 2 battles of a war that they weren't expecting, right? You know, it's like judging the U.S. Army military in World War II by Pearl Harbor, you know? Okay, that's not a good measure of how the U.S. Navy fought that war, right? And Lexington conquered Bunker Hill are not very good metrics of how the British Army fought the Revolutionary War. Always, when you look at the first couple battles in a war, any war, they tend to be anomalous somehow. And these 2 battles around here, Lexington conquered and Bunker Hill, there were no other battles where that happened to the British Army during the war. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be proud of how the American Army did during the war, but they're not good examples of how an 8-year-long war went by looking at what happened in the first 2 months. Right? So, you know, and a lot of, if I was a European military scholar, I'd really argue about whether the British Army was the best, because there's a lot of different ways you can measure that, right? But they were really good. There was a question. Okay, I want to get other people involved first, so we're going to.
Did the deserters tend to stay here, or did they go back to Britain?
That's a complex subject, but well, it turns out that I do know for some of them, and some of them did settle here. Overall desertion rate in the British Army during this era, during this war, 5 or 6% or so. Was that high or low? Exactly. No. Continental Army desertion rate during the American Revolution. 15, 20, some scholars say up to 25%. Other European armies during the 18th century often gets up in the desertion rate of 5 or 6%. Some people will think of it as high, but by the standard of the era, it was a pretty low desertion rate. Some of these guys did, in fact, stay and settle in America. I've met descendants of British soldiers who still live here. The first guy on the first slide, Samuel Lee, I said if you already know about him, because he was captured on April 19th. He ended up settling in Concord and marrying and starting a new family, even though he had had a wife and children in Boston. I don't know what became of them. But so it varies. There are men who were written off the muster rolls as deserters because they were lost track of, but they ended up escaping from captivity and joining the British Army again, but in other places. So their original regiment didn't know what happened to them, but they in fact came back and joined the Army again somewhere else. So it's difficult. We can't track all of them, but definitely some of them did settle in America. The key is that there's no generality. These are all individual people with individual motivations and stories. I'm going to take one in the way back, and then we'll go over here.
Did the British Army change much from the army that fought during the French and Indian War in the 1760s? Did they learn much that they applied to the American Revolutionary War?
Absolutely, yes. But I don't study the Army during the French and Indian War in enough detail to go into a lot. One thing that I know straight away is that at the beginning of the French and Indian War, they tried pressing soldiers. And some of those soldiers on Braddock's expedition were pressed. And it went badly. So they stopped pressing men. Pressing tended to happen only in wartime, only in limited circumstances. I don't know the details of that press act, but I know that was tried at the beginning of that war and then stopped. And the British learned a great deal about fighting in frontier places during the French and Indian War. They created organizations called light infantry corps, which they disbanded at the end of that war, but then decided to reinstitute in 1771. I had said earlier that light infantry companies in British regiments were new things. Well, they were conceived during the French and Indian War, but they weren't institutionalized until the early 1770s, and they became the tip of the British Army's spear during the war in America. And probably a lot more, but I don't study that war and the evolution of the Army enough to really comment on that. We're going to go here again.
Thank you. All right. One of the personalities you focused on in your talk was a fellow who belonged to the 59th. And I have some focus on the 59th. I know they were in Salem briefly, and then they took it on the chin, so to speak, at Bunker Hill and disbanded. Do you have any details of what happened to them at Bunker Hill? What caused them to disband? How many were wounded or what?
Well, one thing is they didn't disband. They got sent back to England, and then they went to Gibraltar, and then on, and stayed in the Army for a very long time. So they didn't disband. They had been in America since 1767. It was typical during peacetime to send regiments overseas for 7 years at a time. They were just getting ready to go home. They were in Nova Scotia in 1774 when tensions rose in Boston. And so they were sent to Boston instead of going straight home. The 65th Regiment, same thing exactly. The 10th and 52nd Regiments were in Quebec since 1767. They were due to go home. They got sent to Boston instead. But by December of 1775, the 59th in particular, they'd been in America for their now 8 years. They had taken some number of casualties at Bunker Hill. I believe only their light infantry and grenadier companies served in the battle. So they didn't, as a regiment, take it on the nose, but parts of them did. But they were due to be sent home anyway, and they were. But when a British regiment in America gets sent home, they look at the regiment and say, well, there's a lot of guys here who are still young and fit for service. The regiment's been in America a long time, but they've gotten new recruits during that time. Some of these guys, they still might be in their 40s, but they're still pretty fit for service. So we'll take all the guys who are fit for service and transfer them into other regiments that are staying over here. And then we'll send only the guys who are no longer fit for service, and the officers and non-commissioned officers, we'll send them home. The guy I talked about was a sergeant, non-commissioned officer, so he's among those sent home. But he continued to serve in the Army a long time in the 59th Regiment. They go back to Great Britain, they start recruiting again. By 1778, they're still a regiment in the Army. They've got a lot more new guys than they had before, but they're ready to be deployed again, and they got sent to Gibraltar. Meanwhile, back in America, all those guys drafted into other regiments. At this time, drafting means to be pulled from one regiment to another. It's like a draft beer or a draft horse. Drafting is pulling. And a lot of those guys who had been in the 59th Regiment then serve in another regiment for a couple of years, and another regiment for a couple of years. Every time they switch regiments, they get a new enlistment bounty, which is about 2 months' pay. So there's a pretty strong incentive. Hey, you want to go back and get your pension, or you like being in the Army? Hey, we transfer you, you get another recruitment bounty. There's a guy I talk about in my book who did this from the 59th. He was drafted into another regiment, and then that regiment was sent back to England. He was drafted again. I don't remember his full story, but I think 4 times he got drafted into other regiments and stayed in North America. So there was like a diaspora from the 59th. There was also a soldier in the 59th named George Marsden who deserted from Boston and went up, I think, into New Hampshire and started training American soldiers there. So it depends. Do we have time for any more questions? Or people? One more question. I'm going to take it from this side of the room because I've been very...
I'm amazed at how much information you've been able to glean from the records. So
Thanks.
I was
There's a lot of records out there.
well, I was wondering, like census records, I would imagine you use a lot, right?
Hardly any.
Journals? Where do you use?
Okay. There's 2 core sources of information. One is muster rolls. So the Army keeps lists of names of soldiers. None of this stuff is online, by the way. If you want to look at British Army muster rolls, you either talk to me or you go to the British National Archives. But muster rolls just carry the names of men. Every 6 months, the British regiment takes a list of all the men in the regiment. And if anybody joined during that 6 months period, it's annotated the date. If they died, deserted, or were discharged, or drafted to another regiment, all the Ds, during that 6 month period, the date's recorded, which is where I get a lot of this, I know how many men died. So we start with all those, but other than that, they're just names. And then all the men who got pensions, or most of them, there's a record of those documents that say how old he was and where he was born and all this. And this is why, out of the 700 men, I know all that stuff about 200 of them, because approximately 200 of them got pensions. So I have the pension details. Fortunately, 200 is hopefully a good statistical sample, unless there's some bias about which men got pensions and which didn't. But, but those are the 2 core things, and then a lot of it comes from all sorts of scattered other sources. I could go.
Do them write journals?
A few of them did. I have a book called British Soldiers, American War that sadly sold out over the weekend in Gloucester. But, I mean, it's still in print. I just don't have any more copies. But that's a compilation of 9 little journals, British soldiers. They're quite rare. I know of 11 altogether. One of them is book length. 2 of them are book length, and the other 9 are shorter, so I compiled them all into a single volume. But yeah, a few journals, there are court-martial records. If you really want to know in detail, you can just get a copy of this book and read the footnotes. Because it's about, it's that much of it is the notes. It's all primary sources. I do not use secondary sources because either there aren't any or they're not very good. But so yeah, lots and lots of notes, lots and lots of records, but you have to piece this stuff together. I talked about this woman's marriage license. Well, that told me her name, and it told me her dead husband's name. She was a widow of this guy, and then I look up his name on the muster roll, and I find the regiment. He died that day, so I know why she was widowed, and then it says who she married. So I know that, and then I can trace his career. But I don't know anything else about her except she got widowed on this date and married on that date. So it's interesting stuff, and always looking for more. If you ever find a document with a name of a British soldier in it, please let me know. All right, thank you all. I wish we